Today we're hearing a brief overview of the Office of Legislative Auditor report on teacher licensure that was delivered almost a year ago. And as a result of that, we had in our spending bill, in the education section, a study group on this licensure report to try to come to some determination as to how to take the recommendations and make this a viable operation of licensing teachers and the governing structure. So we'll start with Judy Randall from the Office of Legislative Auditor. She will provide a summary, which members you have in your packets. It is entitled Minnesota Teacher Licensure, dated the 17th today, with a few slides from what would have been the PowerPoint presentation. Welcome, Ms. Randall, and please say your name for the record and begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Program Evaluation Division. And as the Chair said, we released this evaluation of Minnesota teacher licensure last March. I believe members should have a copy of this report as well. If not, we can get you that. So I'm going to just quickly go over our high-level findings and recommendations from that evaluation. And there should be just a one-page handout in your packet as well with the key slides. Really, the bottom line from that evaluation is that we found significant problems with Minnesota's teacher licensure system, really from top to bottom, kind of problems at all levels. And we don't say that kind of that bluntly and that dramatically very often. We found problems with the statutes and laws that govern teacher licensure. They were the terms were undefined, it was extraordinarily complex, it was contradictory in places. We found problems with the governance structure, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into this, but as you probably know, there are two state entities, the Minnesota Department of Education and the Board of Teaching, that have responsibility for teacher licensure, but their responsibilities and roles are overlapping and confusing, and so it results in a lot of finger pointing. And then we also found problems in the implementation of teacher licensure, really from the point at which somebody goes to apply for a license, kind of to the back end when they find out whether or not they got a license and why not. The key legislative recommendations are to clarify the statutes, and I know the legislature made some efforts on this last session that helped. I think there's probably still some ways to go. We recommend restructuring the teacher license system, so the actual licenses and the names and the organization of that system. We recommend installing a tiered licensure system, and I'll get into the details a little bit further in a moment. And then we recommend consolidating all teacher licensure activities into one state entity. So they're kind of broad, big recommendations, which is what I know the study group took up during the interim. So let me just kind of take a quick step back and remind everybody kind of how it works to get a license here in Minnesota to teach. Teachers are licensed for a subject area and a grade level, so secondary level math or K-12 Spanish, elementary. So it's the intersection of a subject area and a grade level. Candidates receive a different type of license depending on the extent to which they have fulfilled the requirements outlined in law. For a candidate who has met all of the requirements, they receive a 5-year full professional license. It's kind of the full license. But if a candidate hasn't passed all the tests or hasn't met all the requirements, there are a series of different types of licenses and exceptions and waivers and special permissions that allow somebody to be in the classroom. I mentioned special permissions are kind of an exception process for candidates who aren't fully licensed, and those are processed through the Board of Teaching, whereas all the other licenses are processed through the Department of Education. And then that gets me back to the point of there are two agencies involved in teacher licensure, the Board of Teaching and the Department of Education. Basically, the Board of Teaching establishes the policies and the standards for teacher licensure, and the Department of Education is like the implementing agency, processing the applications, reviewing the applications, and making licensure determinations. I'm going to go a little quickly through this next set of points related to our finding about the statutes, just because I don't think that was necessarily the main focus of the study group. We can certainly talk about that at another time if you want, but I think the key points are to know that the statutes related to teacher licensure have changed frequently, like annually, which makes it really difficult for candidates to know what's expected of them, and it makes it even difficult for the licensing specialists at the Department of Education to know what criteria, what rules are in place in a given year, and which rules to apply to a given candidate. We had specific concerns that we drew out in the report related to changes the 2015 legislature made. As some of you may know, in 2015, I think the legislature heard a lot of concerns from folks who had been licensed in another state to teach, came here to Minnesota to teach, and really had a difficult time getting those teacher licenses. And so in response to what the legislature heard in 2015, the legislature made some changes in terms of the requirements for folks who were coming from out of state. I think they were well-intended. I think there were some unintended consequences, however. In particular, we noted that some of the requirements for student teaching experience in particular are much lower now for teachers who were licensed out of state than they are for teachers who were prepared out of state than for those who were prepared in a Minnesota teacher preparation program. So just as an example, as part of our evaluation, we sat in on licensure committee meetings that happened between the department and the board for candidates that were kind of unusual. And there were several times where there were different candidates from different preparation programs in Florida, happened to be, where they had fulfilled the requirements of this Florida teacher preparation program. They had been licensed in Florida. They had never taught in Florida. And they had 5 days of student teaching experience. And because of the way the law was written, they received a full license. If that same candidate had been prepared in a Minnesota teacher preparation program, they would not have met the requirements. They need 12 weeks of student teaching to meet the requirements in Minnesota. So again, I think there's been a lot of changes to the statutes, well-intended, but sometimes it results in further complications. Okay, let me switch or move to some of the recommendations that we make based on what we saw with the licenses. So the first recommendation to the legislature is to clarify the statutes. Use defined terms, use those terms consistently, perhaps reduce some of the complexity in the law. And again, there have been steps towards this, and I think those efforts are continuing. The other recommendation we make is to consider what we call a tiered licensing system. And if you have your report in front of you, it may be easiest to, I don't know, do folks have this? It would be easiest to look at page 77. There's a really tiny version of it on the handout. But page 77, I think, lays out better what we're talking about when we're talking about a tiered licensure system. The reasons we recommend this is, there's many reasons. One is we think it really lays out clear expectations of what's required to get a license in Minnesota. Let me, I guess, walk through the different tiers, of course, have different levels of expectations and criteria. Tier 1 is, frankly, a pretty low bar, right? What this says is if a school district or a charter school wants to hire somebody and they meet one of those following criteria, they could get a Tier 1 license. Now, I think that makes people uncomfortable because you look at that and you say, well, I don't know if I want that person teaching my kid physics, right, if they just have one of these lower level criteria. What I would say is these Tier 1 standards are no lower than what currently exists for somebody teaching as a non-licensed community expert with a special permission. So the system already has something in place to allow people who meet this level of criteria to teach. And what we're suggesting, we created this tiered system to kind of hold the existing system harmless. So we're not shifting the standards up or down. We're saying, given the standards that are in place now, and of course, you all can make decisions to change that, here's a Tier 1 that would allow school districts some flexibility, but also show people what's expected to get to the next tier. So that's the idea behind tier. It's a low level of entry. School district, charter school has to want to hire you, but still it's a low level of entry, but then let's move that person through the system, through the licensing system. I'm going to jump to Tier 3, which is where I would expect kind of most teacher candidates to enter. This is where a person would enter if they had completed a teacher preparation program and met all teacher licensure requirements that are currently in law. Tiers 4 and 5 then provide an opportunity for career growth, recognition of mastery in teaching, recognition of, say, national board certification. The reason why we think this is an improvement is there's only 5 licenses basically here instead of multiple different licenses in statute, different types of variances, waivers, exceptions. Frankly, the language itself gets complicated. This helps to streamline the language around licensure, and it also makes really clear what's expected for candidates, and it helps schools, legislature, the public understand what's expected. I'm going to move on. I know the licensure study group spent quite a bit of time talking about the tiered idea, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it. It's a new idea for Minnesota, but again, we think it would allow some flexibility, but also consistency across candidates, and again, that clear expectations. Okay, I'm going to move on to I know I'm going really fast here, Madam Chair. Okay, if people have questions, of course, I'm happy to answer them. Moving now to the governance issues. As I mentioned, the Department of Education and the Board of Teaching both have responsibility for teacher licensure. And I think the slide says, lines of responsibility are blurred. That's really a generous characterization. As part of our evaluation, we conducted surveys of charter schools, school districts. We surveyed teacher licensure candidates who had been prepared outside of state who were applying to Minnesota for a teacher license. We heard from more than 700 of them. We talked to stakeholders. I mean, we talked to anyone who would talk to us, and we reached out to others. And across all of those conversations, all of those surveys, really the common theme was the structure is confusing, it's complicated, it's frustrating, there's finger pointing. I think because the lines of responsibility are not clear, it's easy to either not know who to go to with a question, go to the wrong entity with a question, or kind of get passed back and forth as people are trying their best to answer questions but not clear who's responsible for what. Frankly, state statutes further complicate the issue. Statutes say the board must issue licenses, but then it also says the department, or that the licenses must be issued by the department. So, the complexity and the confusion is throughout. As we were doing this evaluation, it was clear to us that we were going to make a recommendation related to governance, but we weren't quite sure what that was going to be. So first what we did is we looked to see how do other states govern teacher licensure responsibilities, and then we also looked to see how does Minnesota license other professions. And when we looked at those two different universes, what we saw is that our current structure for licensing teachers is really an anomaly. If I can direct you to, I think it's pages 90 and 91.
92. No, you're correct,
90 and 91, okay. So let's start at 91, which is a table that shows how Minnesota licenses other professions in Minnesota. And we kind of identified three main models on how Minnesota licenses professions. The first is on the left column, and that's with the Independent Professional Licensing Board. So you'd be familiar with that with like the health licensing boards. On the far right column are professions that are licensed by state agencies, and the Department of Commerce licenses a lot of these professions, insurance agents, real estate brokers, those folks. And then you can see in the middle is this hybrid, this board and state agency hybrid, and there's really very few professions to be identified having that type of regulation and oversight. Teachers, school administrators, and then other professions like electricity, related to electricity and plumbing. Okay, so we saw that, and then we looked to see how other states license teachers, and that's the table on page 90. And again, you can see Minnesota is a bit of an outlier. We're in the far left column there with kind of this board. And then you can see there's a lot of different models with different uses of board and reliance on a state agency. And what we found is that while not a majority of states, more states than anything else had teacher licensure overseen by like their Department of Education. So that was more like a state agency model. If you go kind of where the plurality of states fall, and then if you look at where our professions in Minnesota are licensed, you see the board model. So when we went to make a recommendation, what we said was, well, the recommendation is to consolidate in an entity. So the official recommendation doesn't say which entity, but it says consolidate somewhere. Because, and I've said this strongly in previous presentations, the current structure is not working. It's not working well for anyone. It's not working well for teacher candidates. It's not working well for school districts. It's not working well for you all. So we really think it needs to be consolidated somewhere. In the report, we walked through kind of the pros and cons of putting it into the Department of Education and the pros and cons of putting it into the Board of Teaching. And there's good and bad to both. Ultimately, we thought it was better to put it in the Board of Teaching for two main reasons. One is whichever entity licenses teachers is going to be the entity that disciplines licensed teachers when they violate the teacher's code of ethics. And we think that discipline oversight makes the most sense coming from peers in the profession. Does it have to? No, but we think that's a good model, and that's kind of what we've done in general, especially with these health-related professions. The other reason why we thought the board made more sense was because one of the key functions, at least as currently structured, related to teacher licensure is to oversee and regulate the teacher preparation programs, to approve those teacher preparation programs. And currently, the Board of Teaching handles that responsibility with the use of peer advisory groups and peer groups. But of course, teacher preparation programs are housed in colleges and universities, right? So they're in higher education programs. And it seemed to us kind of an awkward fit to have the Department of Education, which of course its jurisdiction is K-12, to have kind of that oversight approval role of higher ed teacher prep programs. Can it be done? Sure. But to us, when we were trying to figure out where made the most sense, we landed on the side of the Board of Teaching. But I think that's been a subject of great discussion for the study group, and I know you'll be hearing more about that. So again, our recommendation related to governance is to consolidate. If the legislature decides not to consolidate, which of course is not our recommendation, but you know, in your wisdom, you may choose to not consolidate, then we think there's some other actions you can take to at least help clarify things a little. So clarify in law which agency is responsible for what. And then we would recommend to the Board of Teaching and the Department of Education to have some interagency agreements to say, this is what we're doing, this is what I'm doing, and so that everybody's really on the same page of who is responsible for what. And then we have some recommendations related to funding the board directly. At least in the past, it had been funded kind of as a rider under the Department of Education, even though it's established in law as its own board. So it just kind of further complicates the who's in charge of what and the relationships between the entities. So with that, Madam Chair and members, I know I went quickly. Hopefully it didn't confuse too much, and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. And we have a question from Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, thank you for the report. This is much needed. This has been a situation that has, been perplexing to this committee for years. And, to reach some clarity, I think, is very important. On the tiered licensing systems, and, as the Office of the Legislative Auditor, you probably wouldn't have been aware of this anyway, but I just want to, for the first time of many this year, make this statement, that there should be something, with criteria elevating it for those teachers who get master's degrees in what they teach. I think that's a very important concept that, particularly in light of the concurrent enrollment difficulties that we are facing with Minnesota being criticized for not having enough master degree teachers in their content area in concurrent education.
Thank you, Representative Erdahl. Representative Pryor.
You'll hear that many times.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One question, just so that I understand better. Sorry, so I understand better because I'm new to this year. So teachers that are teaching post-secondary classes in high school, do they fit in somewhere in the tier system? Is it specifically recognized that they would be licensed to do that?
Ms. Randall.
Madam Chair, Representative Pryor, thanks for the question, because it also helps me address what Representative Erdahl just raised regarding teachers with master degrees who may or may not be teaching the post-secondary. In our sample tiered licensing system, it doesn't recognize that, but there's no reason it couldn't. And I think, frankly, that's one of the great things about a tiered system. This sample on page 77 was just, here's a sample to get the conversation started. We had no illusions that this would actually be the final system implemented. But I think something like having the master's degree or being qualified to teach those post-secondary classes in the high school could be something at a tier 4. Or the master educator license level, one of those higher tiers to reflect the deeper content skills or other skills that those teachers have.
Other questions from members? Miss Representative Kunish-Podine.
I have a question about how this relates to charter schools. I know that in some charter schools, they have teachers that are not licensed in certain areas. They don't have the specificity for their, whatever subject that they're teaching. How would this affect charter schools?
Ms. Randall?
Madam Chair, okay, now, Representative Kunish-Podine, is that right? Oh, good. Thank you for the question. So in general, I would say it would apply the same. It would apply to all teachers teaching in public schools in Minnesota, and of course, charter schools are public schools. There are, I know, some charter schools right now, for example, that follow a model like a project-based charter school, where you have one teacher who's teaching across multiple different subjects. And so they may be licensed as a math teacher, but they're also overseeing these students doing social studies and English. And so they're working on a type of variance to allow them to do that. I do think there would have to be a little bit of flexibility built into the tiered system to accommodate for some of those. But what I would recommend limiting the number of exceptions to the system, because I think if you keep adding exceptions, then you get back to where we are now. But I think if there could be maybe one or two broad exception categories, either for something like the project-centered learning, or there are some subject areas for which a license is not available. I think Hmong language was one of them, where there's not currently a teacher preparation program leading to a license. So there would need to be some recognition of some of those unique situations built into the tiered system, but I wouldn't recommend that we overrun the tiered system with exceptions, because then I think you're back to where we started. Does that help? Does that answer? Okay.
Thank you.
Representative May Quaid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just because I'm new to the committee, I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through how we ended up in a situation where we have this language that says Board of Teachers issues license and Department of Education, just so we don't end up in that same place.
Ms. Randall?
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair. And Representative. You know, we have a little bit of history in the evaluation. I think where it came from, and Madam Chair, I think you might have better history on this than I do, is we used to have a state board of education. And it had a lot of these kind of responsibilities of oversight of teachers and licensing. And over time, the responsibilities in the board started slowly kind of getting pulled away and pulled into the Department of Education and pulled into other places until the Board of Education was officially abolished, I want to say in 98.
Yes.
Is that about right?
Officially.
Sorry?
Officially, yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. And then at that time, there was kind of a broad change to the language that basically just kind of moved everything the Board of Education had been doing at that time to the Department of Education. It was kind of like a mass reviser's change, if you will. And so, you know, there was a lot that had to get transferred, and so things weren't necessarily parsed out at that time. So I think that is where some of that duplication and complication came in. And I think, you know, you all face a lot of issues and are busy and are reacting to the issues that come before you. And so I think there hasn't been time to kind of have this step back and this holistic view, which is thankfully what we are able to do on a small number of projects each year. And so I think it just took time. You know, there was that mass change, Board of Education, tweak, you know, tweaks over the years, and here we are.
And Ms. Randall, when I served on the Board of Teaching, it was much simpler because that's when we still had the Board of Education.
Yeah.
So we didn't have this confusion, and those were good days. And then we evolved to this, and here we are, having to fix it, of course. But thanks for your question, Ms. Makewaid. Other questions? Members, I think it's important that you do read this audit report. This is extremely well done. The auditors, Ms. Randall, it was you and two others, correct? Would you name who else assisted?
Madam Chair, absolutely, I'd be happy to. It was Sarah De La Cueva and Katie Reed with our office.
Thank you
Yeah.
for giving them credit, because
Thank you.
this covered so much ground that we can see in this report that it's very comprehensive, and that's why we had the study group. But members, starting on page 4 is a list of the content areas as of July 1 that are licensed in our state. And perhaps when Ms. Doan comes forward, you would like to ask her about that, grouping the content area, because I know it lists science, but science is much more comprehensive or extended than just the word science. So you may have questions, because I'm sure you hear from your teachers sometimes, or from school boards or administrators, the needs that they have in the science area, and yet the licensing is complicated there. So that's a good question to ask. Then preparation programs on pages 8 and 9. We have Bemidji State University as an example of a teacher preparation program and what is offered. And then a listing of the teacher preparation program institutions on page 8. That's also invaluable information as we move forward. We also have an alternative teacher preparation program. This was a pathway to an alternative standard that we actually an alternative pathway to licensure. That was the first bill the governor signed in 2011. And we might want to ask Ms. Doan to what extent we know that's being used. And then, of course, on pages 12 and 13, we have paragraphs on the teacher shortage, the achievement gap, before we get into licenses and licensure requirements. So every section, every chapter of this report really has comprehensive information that I think would be invaluable for you to read before we have the presentation of bills. And I'm sure we'll have more than one. I will certainly have one. And there may be others that come forward as well. So any other questions for Ms. Randall? Thank you, Ms. Randall, for taking the time to come from your office to our hearing room to share this with us, because you actually are the experts. And thank your assistants. Very good.